In the spring of 1927, the U.S. government made a decision that most Americans have never heard about. To save one city, they deliberately flooded another. They packed dynamite along a levee, lit the fuse, and let the Mississippi River pour directly into the homes of thousands of people who had no idea it was coming. This is the story of the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927, the largest natural disaster in American history up to that point, a catastrophe so massive it reshaped an entire region, exposed brutal injustice, and quietly helped launch a future American president. The winter of 1926 into 1927 brought record-breaking rainfall across the central United States. Month after month, storm after storm dumped water into the Mississippi River Basin, an enormous drainage system pulling water from parts of 31 different states and 2 Canadian provinces, roughly 41% of the continental United States, all funneling toward a single river. By early spring, the river system was already carrying more water than engineers had ever recorded before, and it was still rising. Standing between that swollen river and millions of people living along its banks was a network of levees, earthen walls built up over decades, some constructed generations earlier by enslaved labor before the Civil War, meant to hold back the river no matter how high it rose. Engineers at the time largely trusted a strategy known as levees only, the belief that tall, strong walls alone, without spillways or floodways to release pressure, would be enough to contain any flood the river could produce. That theory was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. On April 16, 1927, near a small Mississippi town called Mound Landing, the river won. A levee that engineers had insisted was strong enough finally gave way, and it didn't just break, it exploded outward with a force witnesses compared to a dam collapsing. The crevasse that opened was eventually estimated at nearly a mile wide, unleashing a wall of water carrying more volume than Niagara Falls, pouring uncontrolled into the Mississippi Delta. Here's twist number 1. This wasn't a slow, rising flood like most people imagine when they picture a river overflowing its banks. Survivors described a literal wall of water, in some places over 20 feet high, arriving with almost no warning, moving faster than people could run, sweeping away homes, livestock, and entire stretches of farmland in a matter of minutes. Within days, levees failed one after another up and down the river, unable to withstand the sheer volume of water now surging through the system. By the time the flooding finally stopped spreading weeks later, it had covered approximately 27,000 square miles across 7 states, an area roughly the size of the entire country of Ireland, displacing over 600,000 people from their homes, with some estimates reaching as high as 1 million once secondary displacement and long-term relocation are factored in. Entire towns across Mississippi, Arkansas, and Louisiana simply vanished underwater. In some low-lying areas, floodwaters didn't recede for months, leaving communities submerged well into the summer, their homes and farmland unusable for an entire growing season. But here's twist number 2, and it's a part of this disaster that rarely makes it into the history books. As the flooding spread, tens of thousands of people, most of them black sharecroppers and laborers living along the river, were rounded up by local authorities and National Guardsmen, not to be evacuated to safety, but to be forced into labor camps on top of the remaining levees, working around the clock in brutal conditions, often at gunpoint, to try to reinforce the walls holding back the water for everyone downstream. Meanwhile, many white residents in the same areas were evacuated to safety on boats and trains as the water rose. Black workers, in large numbers, were held back, denied evacuation, and made to keep working the levees under armed guard, even as the water kept rising dangerously close around them. Refugee camps set up afterward across the flooded region were often segregated by race, with black survivors receiving smaller food rations, worse shelter, and far worse overall conditions than white refugees receiving aid in the very same relief effort, run by the very same federal government. The man placed in charge of the entire national relief operation was Herbert Hoover, then serving as Secretary of Commerce under President Calvin Coolidge. Hoover organized what was, at the time, one of the largest disaster relief efforts in American history, mobilizing hundreds of boats, thousands of tents, and tens of thousands of volunteers across the flooded region, coordinating supply lines that stretched across 7 states simultaneously. Newspapers across the country ran daily updates on Hoover's efforts, turning what had been a relatively obscure cabinet official into a household name almost overnight. And here's twist number 3. The flood essentially built Herbert Hoover's path to the presidency. His visible, hands-on leadership during the crisis, touring flooded areas personally, appearing in newsreels distributed nationwide, and being credited publicly with saving countless lives, made him a national hero in the eyes of much of the American public, directly fueling his successful presidential campaign just 3 years later, in 1928. This all happened even as reports of the mistreatment of black flood victims under his own relief operation were already being documented by journalists and civil rights advocates at the time, and largely ignored or downplayed by Hoover's administration both during and after the crisis. Then came the decision that, to this day, remains one of the most controversial moments of the entire disaster. As the flood crisis reached New Orleans, city and business leaders grew terrified that rising water upstream could overwhelm the levees protecting the city itself, potentially destroying the financial and commercial heart of the entire region, and along with it, the fortunes of the city's wealthiest banks and businesses. Their solution: deliberately dynamite a levee downstream, at a place called Carnarvon, to relieve pressure on the river and protect New Orleans from a catastrophic breach. The catch: that levee protected 2 mostly poor, rural parishes, St. Bernard and Plaquemines, home to thousands of trappers, fishermen, and small farmers, many of Cajun and Isleño descent, who had far less political power and far fewer connections in New Orleans than the businessmen pushing for the levee's destruction. On April 29, 1927, engineers detonated explosives along the levee, deliberately flooding those downstream communities to save the city upstream. Residents were promised fair financial compensation for their losses. In reality, many waited years to receive even a fraction of what they were owed, some receiving next to nothing at all, and some historians studying the decision decades later argue the dynamiting wasn't even necessary to save New Orleans in the first place, that the city's own levees, according to later analysis, likely would have held regardless, meaning entire communities may have been sacrificed for a threat that never fully materialized. In the aftermath, the flood permanently changed the region. Hundreds of thousands of displaced black families, having endured forced labor, segregated relief camps, and government neglect during the disaster, made a decision that would reshape American demographics for generations. They left the South entirely in the years that followed, refusing to return to the same plantation-style sharecropping system that had trapped their families for decades. This became a significant driving force behind what historians call the Great Migration, one of the largest internal movements of people in American history, as millions of black families relocated over the following decades to cities in the North and West, fundamentally reshaping places like Chicago, Detroit, and New York in the process, cities whose cultural identity today is inseparable from the communities that arrived during this migration. The flood also permanently reshaped how America managed its rivers. In its aftermath, Congress passed the Flood Control Act of 1928, one of the most significant pieces of infrastructure legislation in American history, fundamentally rebuilding the nation's approach to flood management and giving the federal government direct responsibility for levee systems along the Mississippi for the first time. A responsibility, and a massive system of levees, spillways, and floodways, that it still maintains today, nearly a century later. The Great Mississippi Flood of 1927 never gets the same recognition as other American disasters. No feature films with household name recognition. No place in the national memory alongside the Titanic or Pearl Harbor. But its consequences quietly reshaped an entire region, its politics, its demographics, its music and culture carried northward by the families who left, And it raised uncomfortable questions, still relevant today, about whose safety mattered, and whose didn't, when disaster struck and difficult choices had to be made. This is the soul of America, a nation that responded to catastrophe with genuine heroism and innovation, while simultaneously revealing exactly who it was, and wasn't, willing to protect.